Welcome to the Coping Podcast, where we share strategies for coping with the stressors of life, especially the difficulties of parenting. And here is your host, Dr. Lee Weiss.
This is Dr. Lee Weiss. I am the host of the Coping Podcast, where I feature top experts on topics like raising healthy children, parenting, and so much more. Please check out my recent interview with dietitian Lara Field, where we talked about how to navigate the complex landscape of eating and feeding children, since this is often a stressor on parents. This episode is brought to you by Coping Partners. Coping Partners is a mental health practice in the Chicago suburbs dedicated to helping children, adolescents, and adults. We help manage various challenges, including anxiety, divorce, behavioral issues, relationship problems, and much more. Check out more episodes of our podcast and our website at copingpartners.com, and you can contact us with any questions you have. Just a quick disclaimer, the information provided is for educational and informational purposes only. This is not intended to provide mental health treatment and does not constitute a client-therapist relationship. The information provided is not a replacement for being assessed and evaluated by a licensed professional and is not intended to replace mental health or medical advice. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Novak to you. Dr. Lisa Novak is a licensed clinical psychologist who specializes in neuropsychology. She is the co-founder of Illuminate Psychological Assessments, a private practice in Wilmette that specializes in comprehensive evaluations for children, teens, and young adults. Lisa also serves on the board of Catch, a local non-for-profit organization that helps parents support the mental health of their youth. When she's not working, Lisa is most likely soaking up snuggles with her two young sons. So thank you very much for being here, Lisa.
Thank you, Lee, for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
And, I'm going to dive right into my first question, which I think is just if you can help us understand when is it that kids would benefit from a neuropsych assessment? When is it that it's wise to call you? Because I think most parents have heard that term, but they don't really fully understand what it entails.
It's a great question and one I get all the time. I think about neuropsych assessments as being a deep dive into the why of something that we're seeing, some symptom, some behavior, some challenge. And the idea of doing a neuropsych is to figure out, okay, we understand that my child's having trouble paying attention, or we understand that maybe, her reading is not quite up to snuff with peers, or we're seeing a lot of dysregulated behavior, but we don't really know the root cause, which of course then means we don't necessarily know how to intervene appropriately. And so when people, whether it's the parents themselves or other professionals working with the child or the school team, determine that there is something up that they haven't quite got the pulse on, we often find a neuropsych evaluation really helpful for illuminating what those challenges are and what the next steps can be to support that kiddo.
That makes sense. And it sounds more complicated than you could just figure out from observing the child like in school. Because some of the symptoms kind of look similar on the surface.
Exactly. And I think there are some times where we do feel like the root cause is pretty identifiable. OCD is an example that comes to mind for me, where sometimes a parent will call and sort of describe a pretty clear symptom presentation of a specific kind of OCD and say there's a family history of OCD and just kind of recognize the challenge. And in those situations, we often say, we're not really sure that a neuropsych would necessarily be the best first step for this child. Instead, it might be much wiser to go straight into intervention. And here are some specific kinds of intervention that would be helpful and try to give them some names and resources. It's really much more so when we don't know the exact reason, or we think we know what's going on, but the child has tried intervention, and the therapist or the speech pathologist or whomever it is saying, this isn't quite working the way we expected it to, or the way that we normally see a growth trajectory. And so we need a little bit more information about what else might be getting in the way.
That makes sense. So if someone feels stuck in treatment, or if again, the child is struggling, but we don't exactly know why, so we don't know how to intervene.
Yeah, and sometimes it's even more nuanced than that. So if we think about something like a learning challenge, sometimes we might actually know exactly what the problem is. So it could be specific to reading or specific to math. And it's very clear on the MAP scores and on the feedback that the teacher is providing that this is an area of struggle for the child. And maybe they're already getting pulled out for different services or supports at school. But the truth is that something like a learning disorder in reading is not the same for every child. There are different reasons why somebody might be struggling with reading. There are these underlying cognitive skills that determine, our ability to decode successfully and to read with fluency. And until we know which of those skills are those lagging issues that are getting in the way, we don't even necessarily know what type of reading intervention will be the most effective for that child.
That makes sense. So it sounds like you are like a surgeon. You're going in, you're really trying to tease apart, right? What is underlying what we see as the problem, so that you can go straight to the kind of the most direct therapy plan or treatment plan.
It's an interesting analogy. I laugh because I feel like I'm actually only half of a surgeon because the surgeon is identifying the problem and then going in and fixing the
Right.
problem. And I do make it very clear because families ask us all the time, once we get these results, what do you do with that information? And our answer is that we disseminate it to the people that need it.
Right.
So we are sharing that information with any private providers that the family is currently working with. We're recommending new providers, new interventions, new services or supports that might be helpful. And then we can certainly help liaise with the school team to advocate for what the child might need there. But we don't do any direct intervention on our end, which is why we need
You
people
just
like you
open
in
them
our
up, but you don't
community.
close it. No, just kidding.
Yeah, exactly. I open them right up and then I'm like, hey, Dr. Weiss, can you please come and close this up for us? We
Exactly.
need to fix the
Exactly.
problem.
So, can you maybe give us an example of, a presenting case you've had? I don't know if focus isn't a regular one that comes up all the time, but something that, a parent says, for example, my child can't focus, he can't sit still, but then you do your neuropsych and you realize it's not because of what they thought. It's not ADHD. Like, how do you kind of tease apart two things that look the same? And it could be focus or it could be something else.
Yeah, I mean, not being able to focus or concentrate is a great example because it is probably what about 80% of the people that call us come in with as their primary question or concern.
Wow.
Whether it is a 6-year-old or a high school student, or sometimes somebody who was successful through high school and then went off to college and is kind of in that failure to launch category of why did this not go nearly as well as we had expected it to?
Right.
And very often the common challenge that the student themselves is describing is I just can't pay attention, I can't focus, I can't sit down to do my work, I'm easily distracted. And so that is a ton of the work we do is to figure out what is underlying that difficulty concentrating. Sometimes it is ADHD. I think that's the first thing we think about when we
Right.
hear inattention is you must have an attention disorder. And sometimes they do. Many times, however, they don't. It is something else that is causing that difficulty focusing. And that something else, really runs the gamut. It could be anxiety, which is an often, a common thing that we're teasing apart is attention related to, a true neurological deficit versus more uh, environmental, more emotional. We know that there's overlap in a lot of these different symptoms. So anxiety is one, depression is another. Sometimes it's a learning challenge. Sometimes it's a language disorder, something that's making it hard for the child to concentrate. So the teacher might be saying, hey, your kid is zoning out a lot and they're not really keeping up with the pace of the class. And it feels like they might, be struggling to concentrate. But then we come to find, well, yeah, they're struggling to concentrate because they're not understanding what's happening in class. And so, of course, they're going to zone out because what else is their brain going to do in that moment?
Right.
So, yeah, that's a big one for us.
Wow. Wow. So, but 80% of the calls, that's the presenting issue is they don't seem to focus.
I haven't run the numbers, but
I
I
mean,
would
about.
say it is a very common
Yeah.
question that we get asked. And sometimes it's that amongst other things, right?
Mhm.
Sometimes it's I'm noticing my kids having more trouble focusing and they're, spending more time in their room and, getting homework done has become more of a drag. And so you start to see this overlay of one challenge mixed with another that, complicates things. And then we
Yeah.
get to tease it all apart.
It is. It sounds, very complicated, and that's why we all need you to be able to kind of go in and do the deeper dive. Have you
Well,
noticed since COVID kind of an uptick of any, I guess, deficiencies, skill deficits, just anything that's more common now than it used to be?
We've seen an uptick in pretty much everything, I would say, since COVID started, which is not to say that the actual prevalence rate of these different, disorders or challenges or things that we're describing have necessarily gone up. What I think has happened largely, and what research has shown us already preliminarily in these first few years, is that things like emotional struggles are on the rise. There are more anxious kids, there are more depressed kids. And what we know is that when we're anxious and our brains are working extra hard just to manage our emotionality throughout the day, it is way more difficult to do things like attend
Mm.
and learn, to do things like sleep well, which then perpetuates the problem. And so I think we're seeing a rise in a lot of these different concerns as a function of, and really stemming from some of the bigger emotional pieces that were tied to everything that COVID brought for us.
Right. So it's interesting. In other words, if you just stayed on the surface and said, okay, this child is having trouble focusing, again, going back to that, you might miss that there's underlying emotional needs that are not being met, and that need to be treated. And you might rush to, psychiatrist for a stimulant, but that's not really what is required.
Absolutely. And people, I think, have actually done that and then come to see us and say, well, we thought this was ADHD. We went to our pediatrician and, filled out a quick rating scale, which will pretty invariably show some attention concerns if the child's having trouble paying attention. And then
Right.
we tried a medication, but it didn't help. And in fact, actually, they seemed more dysregulated and we were seeing these other challenges. And so now we'd like to really understand what is underneath that. Um,
Right.
yeah, the other thing I would say about COVID is that definitely there's been, to a degree, an impact on academic functioning. And we're really trying not to make too much of a deal out of that because it's not one child that fell behind or that was struggling. It's really all of them, which is helpful because then the class just has to move at a slightly different pace and pick up on concepts that maybe weren't grasped when they should have been. And one thing that has been really helpful with evaluations, I think, is teasing out a true learning disability or disorder versus maybe my child just hasn't spent enough time back in the classroom, especially the youngsters, the K and first grade and second grade,
Right.
to really hone in on those reading and math skills.
Right. Even I've talked to some parents of preschoolers and kindergarten, or I guess kindergartners who would have been in preschool, and they just, they didn't have circle time. They didn't have time to play really with friends and read facial expressions. So there is a lot of catch up, it seems, in these basic skills, and of course, reading and academic skills as well.
Definitely. And
That
I've
makes
had,
sense.
colleagues and friends who are teachers or school psychologists sort of say, like, it's not mathematically possible that this many students have learning disorders. Like, it just
That's
can't
good
be the
news.
case. And so they're drowning and trying to figure out what to do. And they've asked me before, like, how are you deciding whether or not this is a true specific learning disorder or
Mhm.
whether or not this is just a function of the past couple crazy years of our lives? And the answer to that for us as neuropsychologists really lies in those underlying skills and characteristics that we're assessing for. So sometimes, let's say I've tested two different, um, let's call them first grade girls, both of whom are really seemingly behind in their reading. What we're trying to figure out is, does this just require, general education and a little bit of additional support, or is this something like dyslexia that's going to require a different type of intervention? And so what we're doing is these reading assessments. We're having them decode familiar words and unfamiliar words. We're trying to see if they can read, a passage and how much they can get through in a minute, as well as what they can understand of what they're reading. And both students' scores are low. Okay, so far all we've proven is, hey, these kids are struggling in reading. Parents came in and told us that. Not a ton of new information yet. Then what we do is the deep dive into those precursors. What do things like their phonological awareness look like? Which is the ability to play with or manipulate sounds within words, which is a critical component for early literacy development. What do things like their orthographic processing skills look like? Another really critical component for learning to read and pick up on sight words. When we see the word the, we're not sounding that out. We need to recognize that letter pattern, know that it's the, and then move on, as well as many other things like working memory, processing speed, all these other things that we assess for. In one of those students, all of those skills were perfectly intact. And that tells us, hey, there's no underlying mechanism at play here that's making reading hard. With a little more exposure, you're going to be just fine.
Just more practice, maybe one-on-one tutor, but she'll catch up eventually.
Exactly. And the other student, it's like, wow, there are some foundational challenges here. That phonological awareness is really well below where we would expect for a child of that age or that grade level. And so we are going to want a very specific kind of intervention to support that reading development. And that's how we differentiate one from the other.
Right. And I'm just thinking how, from the child's perspective, how, I guess, reassuring this must be that once you figure out the why, they can much more quickly get the supports they need and feel less frustrated. Because what I see in treatment is, the kids are very frustrated when they aren't doing well in school and they know that and they feel that, or they're really struggling. And especially if we just don't really grasp how to help them.
Absolutely. I mean, and that buy-in from the child is so critical right from the get-go of our evaluation process. And, parents ask me all the time, like, how do I talk to my kid about the fact that we're putting them through this evaluation, or what they'll be doing, or what to expect? And I always talk about how, what we want to do largely is take a strengths-based approach here and say, part of Dr. Lisa's job is to figure out what you're really good at. Because everyone has things we're really good at, things that are hard for us. And if we can figure out what you're really good at, we can use that to help with what's harder.
Right.
The second piece to really get that buy-in is, what are those things that are harder for you? And sometimes the thing that's harder, the reason the parents are bringing that child in for the evaluation is actually not the same as what the child might say is hard for them. But we don't really care, because we're going to answer all of those questions through the process. It's, what does the child wish were different for them? And so sometimes it's, executive functioning concerns coming from the parents, and, homework is a battle, and they're losing all of their materials, and they're about to go into middle school, and we're worried about the increased need for supports at that time. And the child might say, like, I mean, yeah, I lose my water bottle sometimes, but it's no big deal. But maybe for that child, there's something else going on. Like, hey, my friends are, seemingly pulling away from me sometimes, or I feel like I've been given feedback that I talk too much, and I don't know how to stop that. And there's something else that's bothering me that I want answers to. And then we join together and say, let's get some answers to those questions.
How nice, because like you said, it's not an either or. It's not like there's an additional fee to, to answer the child's questions too. But that way the child feels like they are doing this work with you. And I know it's fun, but they're going through this and they're going to get something out of it too that's meaningful and important to them. I love that.
Yeah. And sometimes it's as simple and complicated as, I wish my parents would not yell at me so much.
Sure.
Because that homework battle that's concerning the parents from this perspective of like, oh man, what is this going to mean when they're in middle school and high school, and how are they going to keep up? From the kids' perspective, it's like, I just want my parents off my back.
Yeah, leave me
alone. Cool. Let's figure out how to do that.
Right. No, that totally makes sense. This is a win-win for all.
Exactly.
Um, so the other buzzword that comes up a lot when people call our office is coping strategies, or I should say buzz phrase. They want to know how can we help their kids develop more coping strategies. And I guess my thought for you or my question for you is, you know, how does your work impact which coping strategies we teach?
A really great question. And I would say it comes down largely to what is the child struggling to cope with, and what other supports perhaps need to be in place for them to be able to access those skills. So there are some coping strategies that I would imagine, and I defer back to you on this as the surgeon that's actually going in and fixing things, that we can use regularly, right? Deep breathing and things like that are going to be very consistent, effective tools for us to use. Sometimes the challenge, though, is maybe we have learned all the coping skills. And when regulated, the child can list them off and tell you exactly what they should be doing.
Totally.
But they're having these bouts of dysregulation where they feel like they're having an out of body experience, literally, and just can't access the frontal lobe of their brain that has this perfectly stored list of things they're supposed to be doing.
Mhm.
And when we figure out why that's happening, it I think allows them to become more available for using the strategies.
Mhm.
One classic example of that is poor impulse control,
Yes.
right? If a child is either diagnosed ADHD or otherwise, but impulse control is a primary challenge of theirs, it may not be a skill deficit. It may be a performance deficit. It's
Mm.
I know what to do, but in that moment, my brain is ready, fire, aim, right? I've already fired before I've had a chance, right? I haven't really given myself the opportunity to think about what tools I have in my toolbox to use. And
Mhm.
so, strategies for slowing the brain down and allowing for that pause moment might be particularly critical for a child like that.
Right.
Sometimes, if we're talking about something like autism or other things that come with sensory sensitivities, sometimes it's the overwhelm in the environment. It is too loud, it is too crowded, it is too overstimulating. And until we can quiet down the environment, I won't really be able to access my tools. And so, how do we find a way and a place for me to go to feel safe enough to access those tools?
That's really helpful, and I imagine I know you go into schools and IEP meetings and 504
Mhm.
meetings, and I imagine that's part of the work is kind of tailoring the interventions or the recommendations, to figure out, for each child what's going on and how do they regulate better because the dysregulation, I know we've spoken about this before, is just it seems like the highest I've ever seen it in terms of just what's going on and being reported all around. And so again, kind of figuring out the why so we know best how to help seems really to be the most important strategy.
Yes to all of that, and
Yeah.
yes to the dysregulation and just the upping of the ante of all of the behaviors, and
Yeah.
it's been rough. It has
Yeah.
been.
Yeah.
The other thing that I'm finding we're tailoring at schools is again, in the same way that, putting full effort into a neuropsych evaluation requires that buy-in, or, getting anything from therapy requires that buy-in from the kid, they also have to be willing to access their accommodations and supports at school. And what I'm finding more and more is that kids are so hyper attuned to their environment and to how they're being perceived that they don't want to look different from
Oh.
their peers. They don't want to get pulled out into that small group. They don't want to, get their extended time by having to take a test in a different room. And
Mhm.
so it's how do we balance not further, creating further anxiety or shaming them or any of that with still letting them access the tools that they need. And I've seen school teams get really creative for, helping support kiddos in that situation.
I was gonna say, give us some examples. I know one example that I can think of is just when they're younger. I'm not so much for middle school, but when they're younger and there's a primary teacher, they've figured out a cue, like a nonverbal cue. Like maybe they'll come and just like, give them like a little tap on the shoulder while they're walking around the classroom or, you know, something just to kind of help get them to maybe grab their fidget or take a little walk out in the hall to take a couple deep breaths and calm down, figure out what is it that they need to do without, feeling like they're shaming the child in front of their peers, because even at those young ages, they don't want to be different and they don't want to be perceived as different. But I was going to say, do you have any other kind of examples that have been effective in the classroom that you can share?
Yeah, I'm going to borrow something actually from some of my favorite authors, which are Dr. Stixrud and Ned Johnson. They wrote The Self-Driven Child, and then more recently, What Do You Say? And they are top of mind for me right now because CATCH, Community Action Together for Children's Health, which you mentioned in the beginning, that I'm a board member of, just hosted a really fabulous presentation last night at GBN where they came to speak to the community. And one of their biggest take homes is this idea of giving the control back to the kids.
Mhm.
And I really do believe that so firmly, that these kids, the more anxious they get and the more stressed out they get, the more they feel less in control of their own lives and the more it spirals them out a little bit further. And so sometimes I find it's truly as simple as, you can have access to this if you want it. It's there for you to use. We're not forcing you into it. But if you're finding that this room is too distracting for you while you take this test, or you're comparing yourself to your peers and getting stressed out that they've flipped to the third page of the test and you're still finishing page one,
Yep.
then you have a different space that you're welcome to go to. But I think all too often we tell kids what they need to be doing, and then
Right.
there's this automatic resistance to that we could avoid if we just give them a little bit more agency in the decision making.
That's really nice. Just empowering them with the power to choose, if this helps, you are welcome to go ahead and sit in the hall and take your test or go to a quiet space or use extra time. Yeah, I know I've
Absolutely.
had a couple of clients who've benefited from that,
Yeah.
when the underlying cause or underlying problem, I guess, has been anxiety.
Mhm.
So they've been looking around exactly what you're describing, young kids actually, but looking around and noticing where they are in comparison to their peers on the test. And it doesn't matter how many times you tell them, just worry about you. They can't sort of like shut it out. And
Yep.
so when they've excused themselves and gone into the hall, they are able to just kind of get down to business and take their time, and they've done much better.
Yeah. Yep.
But that's really interesting about the control, especially because, again, going back to COVID, not that we have to stay forever in that, but control was a big issue, right? What did you have
Sure.
control over and agency over, and what was out of your control? And it's
Mhm.
interesting that that's still such a prevalent concern.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's been a concern for a long time. I think you're so right. It just felt magnified over the past couple of years. And I think we are not doing and I can speak for myself very much as a parent to two younger kids. I'm not doing as great of a job as I think I can be about giving my kids more control over their own lives. And it comes out of love and and a desire to support and to keep them safe, but it really in many times sends the message that if I'm not doing all these things for you and controlling your homework and controlling how you're
Mhm.
spending your free time and controlling all these things, then I don't trust that you'll be okay. And so it actually
Mhm.
ends up making them, I think, feel less safe and more anxious.
Right. No, it's interesting. Parents yes, all of us, ourselves included, are it sounds like overdoing, right? Doing too much for our
Mhm.
kids. Um, and I think you're right. It's probably, I mean, the parenting kind of generation already was a little bit more on the helicopter parent side, right? We've
Mhm.
always been a little bit more, again, myself included. It's hard to not, right, to engage.
Yeah.
But then with COVID, I think again, everyone felt helpless and everyone's very hands on. I have a couple of young adults who went to college and all of a sudden realized their parents weren't there in the same way to proofread papers and to make sure they registered on time. And they're able to navigate through it, but they noticed it was a bigger challenge than they expected. And so I'm trying to reflect and help parents of younger children to kind of, take a step back and do less and less, because that's how they do develop those skills,
Yes.
to be able to be independent one day. And so that seems very far off for many of the young, the young families that we're working with, but you can't start too early, even just tying your shoe or what can you do on your own, rather than waiting for mom or dad to step in.
Exactly. And also helping them learn that they can solve their problems on their own instead of us, swooping in to fix everything right away.
Right.
Yeah.
No, great points. That's a
Yeah.
great point. Um, I know you, again, through Catch, have really encountered wonderful speakers and presenters. And I was curious if there were any other kind of favorite mentors, speakers in the field, authors that you can recommend, books for parents that they might benefit from reading, podcasts, anything like that.
Yeah, absolutely. A few of my favorites are Tina Bryson and like the whole brainchild. I think with Dan Siegel is one of hers. But another one and an author I reference frequently is actually Dr. Ross Green. And I find him coming up a lot in the work that I do with families because sometimes part of the question that parents come to me with has sort of this undertone that we have to, bring into the room of, is there a problem or is my child just being lazy? Is my child unmotivated? Is my child, just choosing to kind of act this way or to push people's buttons or whatever it may be? And taking straight from Ross Green, kids do well when they can. And I am an extremely firm believer of that. And so that's a conversation that I have with parents all the time that I don't yet know what's going on. But when you're identifying the problem that you're describing, these like meltdowns that the kid is having at the end of the day, or this refusal to do things that feel like, regular daily routines in the morning and getting ready, and yet somehow it just turns into a whole to do day after day after day, it's not fun for you as the parents. It is also not
Not fun
fun
for the
for your
kids
child.
either. Right.
It really is not. And so something is getting in their way. There is a lagging skill there that
Right.
we haven't figured out yet. So we don't yet know exactly what to do about it. But sheer laziness doesn't ever seem to be the right answer.
I love that because, again, it gives parents a little bit more patience, I think, and empathy
Yeah.
for their child in these very difficult and trying moments, right?
Yeah.
Again, that we can certainly relate to on the parent side, but that we know if parents are able to kind of look at it through this different lens, it's going to what's the word? It's going to make the whole
It's
meltdown or the process much smoother, I think.
diffuse. It
Like
diffuses with the
de-escalate, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But also, like you said, it helps us understand where it's coming from, why it's happening, so we can work on it,
Yeah,
rather than just repeat this every single day and be frustrated.
absolutely.
That's really helpful. And I think those are the calls that you're getting and that we're getting too, a lot more again than we used to. But probably, like you said, there's a skill set missing, and we just need to kind of figure out what it is. Can you give
Absolutely.
maybe one or two like differentials as to what that could be attributed to? Just
Like a
meltdowns and, power struggles, things like that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think some sort of underlying emotional challenge is often one of them. So, whether there is heightened anxiety, even when the child is not saying, I feel scared, I feel worried, I'm nervous to go to school, they often don't have the language to understand that anxiety is what's underlying that,
Mhm.
or, depression or other, forms of mood lability.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's more of like a social skill deficit where they really don't have age appropriate social skills in terms of making inferences and understanding body language and facial expressions. And so they're actually misinterpreting situations a lot of the time and misreading a tone as being overly negative when maybe it was more neutral. And then that's kind of causing them to escalate very quickly in situations where the people around them are wondering, why are you getting so upset right now?
Right. So they're reading it so differently than how it was intended. Yeah, and I
Exactly.
imagine that's where a referral to a social skills group or,
Yes.
a speech path to understand some of those nuances and language and body language may be helpful too.
Yes, very
Yeah.
much so. And then the other one that I think is lesser named is the emotion regulation component of
Mhm.
ADHD. I think a lot of people think about ADHD in terms of just I can't pay attention, or I can maybe hyper focus on something. My executive functions, my planning, my organization, or I can be impulsive. But I think that what gets missed a lot is that there is a huge emotion regulation component to ADHD, where, in the same way that they don't have the brakes to slam on, so they're blurting out in class, they also don't have those breaks when they're going from 0 to 60 emotionally. They're getting triggered. It seems like what we call a small problem, but they're having a big reaction to that small problem because they can't slow themselves down. So.
I remember attending a seminar with Dr. Russell Barkley, who's, one of the gurus on ADHD. And he said, he really wanted to rename ADHD to emotional regulation disorder. And he was saying, I'm not successful so far, but I really, really, really think it should. And it totally makes sense because there's so many pieces that are dysregulated. But I think it was just dysregulation disorder or something that he wanted. But it does make sense. And I think you're right. It's not something that most people really think about or know. But it definitely seems to be like a crucial component of ADHD. So not to kind of forget that piece.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is unbelievably helpful. I was going to say any, last pieces of advice for the parents listening, any other tidbits you want to share?
Oh, that's a good one. Last pieces of advice. How long do I have? I would just say lean on the people that you have in your circle to start asking questions if you're concerned. And that largely includes the school system. I think people don't go to the source enough with their kid's teacher, or, if their kid sees the social worker at school to say, hey, I'm noticing some increasing challenges at home. Are you seeing this at school? Is there anything that we can do? Or really bringing additional concerns to any private providers that the kid is already seeing. You can get a lot of information about, what's happening in different settings and whether there seems to be a pattern or something worth further exploring when you reach out to the people around the child, as opposed to relying exclusively on what you're seeing at home.
Yeah. So it sounds like even kind of noting patterns, maybe jotting down notes, putting a Google Doc together with all the providers or your spouse or just other people in the child's life to try to figure out when is this behavior happening or when are they struggling the most, just to have some information. And then they can bring it to you if it becomes necessary. But just trying to be a detective a little bit, it sounds like.
Exactly. That's what I get to do all day. I get to be a detective. It's fun.
It's very fun. Do you have a fun detective hat? Do you have
Good. I need a magnifying glass and a whole cloak.
like Sherlock Holmes of neuroscience. I love it. I love it. Well, everyone, please check out Dr. Novak's website, illuminateneuropsych.com. She has a wonderful team. We've had wonderful experiences with all of the neuropsychologists that you have on your team. And so check out her website for great information. And please check out more episodes of our podcast found on the copingpartners.com website. And thank you so much, Dr. Novak, for coming on today.
Thank you so much for having me. And I could do this all day. You know that, Lee.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Coping Podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes. And check out our podcast page at copingpartners.com.